What were Soviet suspicions over the opening of a second front in Western Europe, and do you think they were justified? From 1942 onward, Stalin began to press the US and Britain to open up a second front in Western Europe to take pressure off the Soviet Union, which was facing the bulk of Hitler's armies. In 1943, the US and Britain decided to invade Italy first. The repeated delays made Stalin suspicious about his allies' motives. In particular, he felt they were stalling on purpose to ensure the USSR was seriously weakened. In all, about 80% of all Axis military resources were thrown against the Soviet Union. By the time a second front was finally opened up in June 1944, there were 228 Axis divisions on the Eastern Front compared to 61 divisions in Western Europe. There were also Soviet concerns over Roosevelt's foreign policy, which he said was based on democracy and economic freedom. The USSR remained suspicious, viewing Roosevelt's open-door policy based on free world trade and equal access to raw materials as being designed to benefit more economically advanced countries, especially the US. As the war was continuing, the Big Three managed to maintain the alliance when they met in Tehran in November 1943. There was initial outline agreement that the Soviet Union, invaded 3 times via Poland since 1900, could restore its 1918 border with Poland, while Poland's western border would move further west at Germany's expense. There was also agreement that no Central European alliance would be allowed against the Soviet Union. These 2 points seemed to remove some of Stalin's main security concerns, though Churchill and Roosevelt were not in total agreement on these issues. Then, on June 6, 1944, the Second Front, for which Stalin had long been pressing, was finally opened up with the start of the D-Day operations. Following the Tehran agreements and the D-Day invasions, Churchill and Stalin met in Moscow in October 1944. They made the informal percentage agreement concerning influence in southeastern and eastern Europe. Although Roosevelt was not present, he was briefed afterwards and made no objections. Poland was not mentioned in any of these briefings. The term superpower was used during the Second World War to refer to the 3 main members of the Grand Alliance. However, even before 1945, it was clear that the USA was by far the most powerful of the 3, both economically and militarily. This was reinforced when the US unleashed its new secret superweapon against Japan in August 1945 and decided to exclude the USSR from the technology. Many historians see this decision as key to the start of the Cold War, but the point is still hotly debated. Both the Soviet Union and the United States claimed they were searching for security after 1945, but each defined this in a different way. In 1945, the USSR was clearly a regional power in Europe, and security meant having friendly states on its border and initiating economic reconstruction. The latter would come in part via compensation from Germany and the other nations that had wrought such destruction on Soviet territory after 1941. However, by 1945, the USA was a global rather than a regional superpower with much greater economic and military power. For the US, security meant primarily the entire world being open to free exchange of goods, money, and people. In particular, according to W.A. Williams, the USA had a vast preponderance of actual and potential power in relation to the USSR from 1944 until at least 1962. This actual and relative inferiority of power played heavily on the minds of Stalin and other Soviet leaders during the Allied conferences and negotiations about post-war Europe. The tensions that finally led to the breakdown of the Grand Alliance and the start of the Cold War began to emerge more sharply at the 1945 Big Three conferences held at Yalta in February and at Potsdam in July. There were 4 main areas of disagreement between the Allies: what to do with Germany and Poland and Eastern Europe in general, also economic reconstruction, and lastly, nuclear weapons. The war against Germany and Japan was ongoing when the Allies met at Yalta in February 1945, but the Second World War was nearly over as far as Europe was concerned. The problems that had emerged at Tehran, especially those concerning Poland and the fate of Eastern European countries, now clearly had to be resolved. At the conference, it was agreed, quite amicably, to temporarily divide Germany into 4 zones of occupation, with outline agreement on compensation for the damage done by Nazi Germany, especially to the USSR. Despite wanting huge reparations from Germany, Stalin was against the idea of splitting Germany permanently into 2. He hoped reparations would both weaken Germany sufficiently to prevent it from becoming a future threat, something that the French also wanted, and allow the USSR to rebuild following the destruction suffered at the hands of the German armed forces. Even as late as 1952, Stalin appears to have opted for a reunited Germany over which the USSR had some influence but not control. Poland proved more difficult and was one of the main issues dividing the Allies at the 2 conferences held in 1945. Eventually, it was agreed at Yalta that the USSR's demands over Poland's eastern borders would be met, and that Poland would receive territory compensation from Germany up to the Oder-Neisse rivers. Stalin believed the Allies had accepted the Lublin, which was mainly communist or sympathetic to the Soviet Union, provisional government for Poland, with few London Poles to be added. However, Churchill remained deeply suspicious about Stalin's intentions and by 1945 had returned to his earlier strong anti-communism. In fact, Roosevelt, by now seriously ill, also began to have doubts about Stalin's intentions to carry out all aspects of the Yalta agreements. Roosevelt died in April 1945, and the more optimistic Yalta axioms soon faded, as the Vice President Harry S. Truman took a more hardline approach to the Soviet Union. Truman refused to listen to Molotov's explanations about why the free elections in Poland promised at Yalta had not taken place. Molotov complained, "I have never been talked to like that before in my life." Truman's response was, "Carry out your agreement and you won't get talked to like that." The Riga axioms put to one side during the war against Germany now increasingly came to dominate U.S. foreign policy. Nevertheless, the Potsdam Conference also saw a final acceptance of Soviet plans for Poland. The issue of Poland was complex. Stalin saw it as a life and death question for the Soviet state, while Churchill saw it as a matter of honor. Yet at Yalta, Roosevelt had backed away from a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Stalin felt such a sphere, which he believed had been decided in essence in the Moscow Percentage Agreement in October 1944, was essential for Soviet security. He was worried by the new U.S. call for the open door policy and the suggestion that there should be no formal spheres of influence. Roosevelt, who had kept the earlier agreements with Stalin about Eastern Europe secret from the U.S. public, suggested that the planned United Nations organization should make decisions about these issues after the war was over. These shifts persuaded Stalin to begin taking practical measures to ensure Soviet security interests in Eastern Europe. When the Soviet Union failed to honor the Yalta Agreement on free elections in Poland, U.S. suspicions about Soviet motives increased. Between 1941 and 1945, the Soviet Union suffered staggering losses, whereas the USA was the only power to emerge richer from the war. According to some estimates, by 1945, 25% of the USSR's pre-war capital stock had been destroyed. It was even worse in the western regions of the USSR that had been occupied by Axis forces. There, the figure was 66%, and population losses are estimated at an incredible 25%. As the Axis forces retreated in 1944 and 45, they carried out a systematic destruction. Hardly a mine, factory, or collective farm remained intact. In addition, over 1,700 towns and over 70,000 villages were razed to the ground. One result of this deliberate destruction was that over 2.5 million civilians were living in makeshift underground hovels. By May 1945, the Soviet economy was in turmoil, while the Soviet people were traumatized. In view of the dreadful destruction suffered by the USSR, Stalin saw economic reconstruction as a priority. However, as already noted, once Truman became U.S. president, friction increased and the U.S. became more determined to contain Soviet power whenever possible. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Truman said the U.S. would only agree to the Soviet Union having reparations from the eastern zone of Germany, which was mainly agricultural and therefore poorer, along with 25% of the machinery from three western zones, if the USSR sent in return 60% of the value of goods received from the West in the form of goods and raw materials, especially coal. In 1944, Stalin made a provisional agreement at the Bretton Woods Conference to join the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The promise of a U.S. loan overcame his reservations about growing U.S. influence in Europe. But when the USSR asked for a $6 billion loan in January 1945, the U.S. imposed conditions, especially on opening eastern markets to U.S. capital. The USSR saw this as dollar diplomacy, which it could not accept. Thus, Stalin placed more emphasis on reparations from Germany. At Yalta, it had been agreed that $10 billion would be a starting point for negotiation. A further Soviet request in April 1945 for a loan of $1,000 billion was lost by the U.S. State Department. Consequently, the USSR allowed the December 1945 deadline for membership of the World Bank and the IMF to pass without signing up. Instead, the Soviet Union decided to increase reparations from its own sphere of influence, which necessitated increased Soviet control over Eastern Europe. The apparent, though partial, agreements reached over Germany, Poland, and reparations were further undermined in August 1945, when the U.S. unleashed the world's first atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. More significant than the bomb itself was the U.S.'s refusal to share the technology with its Soviet ally. At the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt had secured a promise from Stalin to enter the war against Japan once Germany was defeated. However, Truman and his Secretary of State, James Barnes, saw the A-bomb as a way of ending the war against Japan without Soviet participation. This would prevent any Soviet demands for influence in Asia, which was seen as vital to U.S. economic interests. The Potsdam Conference was delayed until July 16th, partly so that Truman could await the results of the U.S. atomic bomb test. Significantly for the later development of the Cold War, the USA's long-term global aims increasingly conflicted with the USSR's regional objectives. From the outset, Stalin interpreted the refusal to share nuclear technology as a demonstration of U.S. power to a seriously weakened USSR. This interpretation of the impact of the U.S. refusal to share nuclear weapon technology with the USSR is supported by revisionist historians like Gar Alperovitz. He argues that possession of the nuclear bomb was seen by Truman and his advisors as a negotiating tool to force the USSR to accept its plan for post-war Europe and the world. Stalin was very concerned about this nuclear monopoly and quickly authorized the development of a Soviet bomb. Despite this, from mid-1944, as Soviet forces took back Soviet territory previously occupied by German forces, Stalin became increasingly aware of how damaged and weakened the Soviet Union was. In all, about 30 million Soviet citizens had died in the war, almost 10 million of them soldiers, about 20% of the pre-war population. By the end of the war, the Red Army was about 11 million strong, but U.S. forces totaled almost 12 million. Because of the need for rapid economic reconstruction, money had to be shifted from defense to industry. According to Khrushchev, by 1948, the Red Army had been rapidly demobilized and numbered fewer than 3 million troops. The more contentious issue at Potsdam were postponed on the understanding that regular meetings of the Council of Foreign Ministers would deal with them. Throughout September and October of 1945, Molotov would agree to widening the base of the governments of Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, and Barnes seemed to prepare to make concessions on this in order to secure a wider agreement. However, this was blocked by John Foster Dulles, a leading Republican who supported the Riga Axioms. There is considerable historical debate about how and why the Cold War began, and about which individuals and states were most to blame. It is also important to consider how other states and their leaders in various regions of the world, such as Israel, China, and Cuba, contributed to the development of the Cold War and its different crises. The Orthodox view usually sees the Second World War as the main cause. Revisionists, however, by the late 1950s had a new explanation. They argued that the US, not the USSR, was responsible for the start of the Cold War. According to these revisionists, the Soviet Union was pushed into establishing tighter control in Eastern Europe by US actions. Post-revisionist views, however, look at it a little bit different. They, on the other hand, number of a distinctive amount of reasons for the Cold War to begin. One argument is the Cold War developed through misunderstandings. Other is the main role of the leaders, that perhaps if FDR had not died and Truman had not become president, perhaps it hadn't, begun. Maybe if Churchill would be more ready to negotiate with Stalin, perhaps it wouldn't have happened. Who knows?